Principle of harmonicity. All market cycles are harmonically related. Each market cycle period is a multiple of a smaller cycle. Doubling or tripling a market cycle period will often reveal another cycle. Key aspects. Each cycle can be broken down into smaller components. The sum of the components forms the larger cycle. The harmonic relationship between two cycles is not fixed. Alright, second principle. In the previous video, we went through summation. Summation means the price action that you see in a chart is the result of adding multiple cycles together. This takes it a step further. This tells us that each of these cycles that we have to add together to form the full picture is harmonically related. Harmonically related means that the cycle durations are not randomly spaced. Rather, they are related to one another by a whole number, usually 2 or 3. Let me explain this a bit further. You've seen this in the previous video. I showed you a 20-day cycle, a 40-day cycle, and an 80-day cycle. Notice that at each of these cycles, and by the way, these are real, you will find the 20, 40, and 80-day cycles in most asset classes. These are related to one another by a factor of 2. Meaning, if I start with a 20-day cycle and I double its duration, I get a 40-day cycle. If I double the duration of that one, I get an 80-day cycle. So a cycle of 20 multiplied by 2 gives me the cycle of 40. If I multiply the cycle of 40 by 2, that gives me the cycle of 80. There is an exception to this, which is crypto. When I started applying the cycles model in crypto, I started with this cycle, the 20-day. I noticed that there was a low, but I could not really find 40-day cycle. Instead, I had to jump straight into this one, 80 days. So remember what I said here in the highlights. Doubling or tripling will often reveal another cycle. It's not always the case. Sometimes you have to do it times 4. Now, don't worry. I'm going to give you the tools to identify these cycles. So once you know of one cycle duration, all you have to do is double or triple that to find the next cycle. If it's not there, you will know it. Just like I did. I could tell immediately in crypto when I started with a 20-day, which was pretty obvious to me that it was there. It took me maybe 15 minutes to realize, oh, there's no 40-day cycle. I have to go straight to the 80-day. Now, usually in most asset classes, I'm talking gold, commodities, metals, stocks, even bonds. The 20 and 40-day cycles are definitely there. You're going to see them. But the important thing to highlight from this principle of harmonicity is just that cycle frequencies are related to one another by a whole number. Likewise, and this may sound obvious, but if I start from a 40-day cycle and I split that in half, I'm going to have a 20-day cycle. If I started with a 20-day cycle and split that in half, I will find a 10-day cycle, most likely. It may be the case that I need to divide it by 3 instead of 2, so there's a roughly 7-day cycle. That's not usually the case though. There are exceptions to this, of course, but usually one cycle will relate to another by a factor of 2. So splitting in half will give you a smaller cycle, multiplying by 2 will give you the larger cycle. And again, there's exceptions to this, but I'm going to show you the tools to find out when that is the case. Now, one final thing that I want to emphasize is this principle that I highlighted here, that the harmonic relationship between two cycles is not fixed. What do I mean by that? So what I'm showing you here obviously is theory. This is a 20-day cycle and it combines into a 40-day cycle, and the 40-day cycles combine to form an 80-day cycle. But let me show you real price action. Let me show you this market. It's Chainlink 2022 through 2023. Let me highlight in red this cycle. This is 160 days. Now, notice this. Clearly you can see this cycle that I traced out here splits into 2. This is harmonicity in action. The red cycle splits into 2 yellow cycles. So you can see they're related by a factor of 2. Now, if I told you red is 160 days, that means yellow is roughly 80 days. But let's go to the previous one. Let's go to red again. Now look at this cycle. This is a 160-day cycle as well. Now it's a little longer. These 2 red waves, they're the same cycle. But if I want to break down this cycle, I cannot break it down into 2. Rather, I need to break it down into 3 components. Even though on average, the 160-day cycle will split into 2 80-day cycles. Sometimes it will split into 3. Specifically, this 160-day cycle will split into 2 roughly average 80-day cycles and 1 slightly short 80-day cycle. So this one split into 2 average. By the way, in most cases, 160 days will split into 2 80-day cycles, but sometimes it will split into 3. In other very rare occasions, it may split into 4. And in even more abnormal and exceptional circumstances, it may even split into up to 5. I have seen cycles that usually split into 2, split into 5 different cycles during powerful uptrends. Again, these are things we're going to learn in future lessons. But the takeaway that I want you to remember here is that, number one, the principle of harmonicity states that every cycle can be broken down into smaller components. Likewise, if we add these components, in other words, if we add these yellow waves, we're going to find the red wave, right? So if we add the components together, we're going to find a larger cycle. And if we split a cycle, we're going to find a smaller cycle. And even though the relationship on average is usually 2 or 3, it can vary. And such is the case here. This is why I picked this example, because we have an average cycle that splits into 2, but then we have a rare cycle, an abnormal cycle that splits into 3. It doesn't change the fact that each cycle breaks down into smaller cycles. It doesn't change the fact that if I add cycles together, I'm going to find a larger cycle. So the definition of the principle of harmonicity is broad. It doesn't tell you, hey, every cycle will break down into 2 smaller cycles. No, that's not what it says. The principle of harmonicity says is that every cycle will break down into smaller cycles, and that every cycle will add up into a larger cycle. That is what the principle of harmonicity states. It also states, usually it will break down into 2. Usually, if I take 2 cycles together, I will find a larger cycle. Usually, but not always. Very important to remember this. It is not written in stone. What is written in stone is that smaller cycles form larger cycles, and the larger cycles are made out of smaller cycles. That is the key takeaway. That's what you need to take away from this.